I was looking at Rishi Sunak's speech yesterday, and I was struggling to get a handle on it, struggling to get a sort of point of entry. So what am I supposed to be scared of? He's promising to protect me from the hooded claw, actually. I think he said at one point, I will keep the vampires from your door. When the chips are down, said the Prime Minister yesterday, I'll be around with my undying, death-defying love for you, which was an interesting departure for a political speech. But the stuff that I'm worried about, even perhaps frightened about, has largely already happened. And so coming on air and saying, what do you fear most, was a contender for our starter at 10 this morning. And yet, sometimes when I ask you questions that are too nebulous, if I set the goalposts so far apart that you actually can't see one goalpost from the other, then it doesn't always work very well. And also, it's a bit, I don't know, it didn't quite bite for me. And then that prison story that Nick was talking about, and revealing the state of our prisons, and that the quotes there from the prisons inspector, and that played almost directly into some ideas that were bubbling away in my brain as I walked down the stairs, because I want to talk about the harrowing tales that we all encountered yesterday about women having a child in England enduring a traumatic birth. I still do a double take, almost like a literal physical double take, like a cartoon character, when I read that 1 in 3 women who have a child in England now endure a traumatic birth. Some of the tales that you heard on LBC yesterday and elsewhere are, hair-raising and terrifying. But the prisons, of course, were being described in similarly chaotic terms in the news bulletin that you heard at 10 o'clock. And once you let that ball start rolling, it is it's deeply disturbing where it leads. Because the other thing that Sunak was talking about yesterday was not just the need to protect us, but also he was criticising Labour for what I believe he might have called doomsterism. Did you come across that word? But think about this for a minute, and I sometimes hesitate. This is what I mean about pulling back the curtains to see for certain what I thought I knew. You sort of worry about a domino effect, because I enjoy our time together every morning. I usually feel better at the end of it than I did at the beginning, and we have some fun together, and we make each other smile, hopefully, and we make each other laugh. So a sort of unleavened diet of doom is not something that I like to serve up every day. Even when we're talking about the dark stuff or the serious stuff, we can usually, or you usually, manage to distract me with a silly text or bring in something a little bit more lighthearted. But if I start with maternity wards and move immediately to prisons, because that is the baton of bad news that has been passed from Monday to Tuesday this week, where does that baton go next? Maternity wards, prisons, schools, NHS hospitals, GP surgery, care homes, water, as in water companies, border checks, probation services. I mean, almost every area of our life that is publicly funded or the responsibility of government has been, well, what word would you use? Almost every area of life hasn't just been sort of diluted or damaged. It's been absolutely decimated. Don't send me pedantic messages about what decimated literally means. It is perfectly acceptable, perfectly permissible to use it, decimated, as a figure of speech, meaning greatly destroyed. Almost everything that they're in charge of has been decimated. Do you know what's in the news today? In the news today, they have abandoned the plans to make homelessness a crime, or to criminalise homelessness. You remember that Suella Braverman wanted to criminalise tents. If you're unfortunate enough to be living in a tent, the then Home Secretary's genius idea to cut down on people living in tents was to confiscate their tents. I remember sitting here and explaining that to you and wondering whether or not I'd sort of accidentally been microdosed with magic mushrooms. The Home Secretary suggesting that the best way to reduce the number of people sleeping in tents is to confiscate their tents. What do you confiscate next? Benches? Grass? Paving stones? And the other story in the news today, which my friend and colleague Henry Riley covered with extraordinary finesse yesterday, I don't know if you've seen or heard the clip of him with and again, here's a phrase that makes you think you've been microdosed with magic mushrooms. The Minister for Common Sense, Esther McVeigh, who is very cross about lanyards. Do you know what a lanyard is? I didn't know what a lanyard was until a couple of years ago. They've sprung up all over the place ever since you sort of need an electronic pass to get into your place of work. You know, you flash your sort of name card at the gate and the gate magically opens. She's very cross about lanyards for reasons that I couldn't really understand, but it had something to do with minorities getting too much support. Rainbow lanyards. So, I mean, that list, you can add to that list if you want. I've almost certainly missed stuff off it. But just in terms of this week, you start with the maternity wards and you hop to the prisons. Then you think about, what about shoplifting, actually? That's in the news as well. And you know about the state of the NHS, the waiting lists and the GP surgeries and the schools. The difficulties, of course, that teachers are having, just keeping afloat. And then you look at the cost of living crisis, you look at the energy bills, you look at the shocking amounts of sewage that are being pumped into our waterways. Everywhere you look, the cuts in everywhere you look. The problems are absolutely immense. And the government has lately, or senior members of government have lately concerned themselves with trying to confiscate the tents of homeless people and ban certain types of lanyards from government buildings. It's as if they're not just nibbling at the edges of problems that we all face. It's as if they're nibbling at the edges of non-existent problems on a completely different planet from the one that we all inhabit. So where am I going with this, you may well ask? And for once, I can tell you. I want to know, because you think about the size of the height of these mountains that I've just described to you. What would it take to get the housing market under control? What would it get to get the NHS back to where it was in 2010, when patient satisfaction was the highest it had been since records began? What will it take to get the prisons fit for purpose? What will it take to get the schools back to where they were in 2010? What will it take to get shoplifting regarded as a crime again, something that you can actually realistically expect to get your collar felt for doing, and shopkeepers will feel protected? What will it take for a GP appointment to be a relatively run-of-the-mill, booking a GP appointment to be a relatively run-of-the-mill affair? What will it take for going into hospital and having a baby being a relatively straightforward, or even perhaps, dare I say, pleasant experience? And you think about what Keir Starmer, if he is Prime Minister this time next year, you think about what he's going to have to do. You sort of begin almost to have a panic attack. Where do you even start with this mess? And it occurred to me this morning that almost all the stories I look at as contenders for our conversations can be filed into two categories at the same time. Question number one is, how did it get so bad so quickly? So just think about that list that I just ran through there. They've only been in power for 14 years, not 40. How did they manage to fluff everything up so completely in such a relatively short amount of time? Right? I kind of know the answers to that. Arrogance, austerity, entitlement, incompetence, prioritising the needs of billionaire donors over the needs of mere voters. I kind of know the answer to that, but I don't know the details. The answer isn't going to be exactly the same when you're talking about schools as it is when you're talking about maternity wards. But the question we need to start asking, and, you know, I've written a book called How They Broke Britain, and the question I get asked most at book events, and there's one in Glasgow on Friday night, which I'm looking forward to. It'd be nice to get up to Glasgow. The question I'm asked most at those events is, how do we fix it? And I don't know, really. If I did, I'd probably be wrapped in ermine somewhere, being consulted like Yoda on a regular basis to fix what appears to be impossible. But that's the question that I get asked the most, and it's time to stop glossing over it, isn't it? It's time to stop glossing over it. How hard is it going to be to fix maternity services? So, you know, and I know how bad it is. You know that the trauma has been caused by mistakes and failures made before and during labour. You know that the massive, massive majority of the men and women on these wards will be even more harrowed by these stories than we are. The idea that you join the NHS, that you sign up to be a gynecologist or a midwife or a nurse on a maternity ward, without wanting to provide the best service you possibly can, and now you are reduced to presiding over a situation in which 1 in 3 women who have a child in England endure a traumatic birth. And one of the reasons we didn't talk about this yesterday was because I couldn't. I found it traumatic just talking about it, listening to some of the callers that Nick took and Sheila took. You just found yourself thinking, holy moly, how did it get so bad? So let's do both of those today in the very specific, and I can't do this every day because it is an unleavened diet of misery, if you like. But it's not misery, it's evidence-based analysis. That's why the Prime Minister calling it doomsterism is so scary. Where does he live, Rishi Sunak, if he doesn't think there are very, very, very serious grounds for deep concern and misgivings about the state of the nation? Where does he flipping live? But let's just pick on one area. Let's just pick on maternity wards, okay? 14 minutes after 10 is the time. And let's do this, okay? How did it get so bad so quick? So my youngest is 16. Crikey. My youngest is 16. So that is 2 years before the Conservatives came to power. And going to the hospital to have a baby was not as easy or as... patience the wrong word, mother-led as it was in 1971. I heard a woman on the radio yesterday talking about what happened in 1971. And I couldn't believe my ears. I'll tell you a little bit more about that after the junction. But the experience 16 years ago was fine. Okay, it was pretty good. No complications, relatively straightforward. Second child, so we knew what was going on. In the space of my daughter's lifetime, maternity care in England has gone off a catastrophic cliff. I want you to tell me why. 0345 6060973 from either within or without. As a patient, as a mother, it's not patient, and giving birth is not a medical procedure. I've already misspoken once today. It can become a medical procedure if something goes wrong, of course. But how has it gone so badly wrong so quickly? 0345 6060973. And how hard is it going to be to get it back to roughly where it was in 2010? Because the more I look at what Keir Starmer is going to have on his plate, and you have to presume he's not going to fiddle while Rome continues to burn. He's not going to get into Downing Street and start talking about lanyards and confiscating homeless people's tents. He is going to try to get this stuff fixed. How hard is it going to be? How are you going to fix it? So how did things go so wrong so fast in the very specific context of maternity wards? And I will, of course, hear some of your stories about just how bad it can be. And how the hell? How on earth? Because this is the big elephant in the room for me now. There's some of the damage that the Tories have done over the last 14 years. Is that done forever now? As you see Rishi Sunak dancing around, complaining about Keir Starmer and talking gibberish about doomsterism. Some of the stuff they've done, some of the stuff he and the previous 4 prime ministers have presided over, is that baked in now? Is that going to be the new Britain? Is that Brexit Britain, where you can't have a baby without having a traumatic experience, where you can't go for a swim in the sea without encountering rivers of poo? Is that it now? That's the question no one asks, because the answer is so dispiriting. But let's focus on maternity wards. How come? So bad so fast. And what does fixing it even begin to look like?